and I'd like to make this participative as far as we can, about reflections on engaging in participatory research that I've been involved in. I sort of, when I said I'd do this title, I thought, well, how have I got here, really? I'm a midwife. I've been doing research. My doctoral research was on the way that midwives learn to become, the way student midwives learn to become midwives. And then from there on, I got involved in other research, or we did some research looking at inequalities and how you prepare midwives to work with disadvantaged women, and how the curriculum needs to be looked at in terms of how you can encourage midwives to engage with disadvantaged women. But from then on, I seem to go quite multi-professional in the type of research that I'm doing. And I think, you know, on one level, being a midwife, I think to myself, well, hang on a minute, I'm a midwife, so why aren't I doing midwifery research? And on the other hand, I realise that because we are all becoming multi-professional quite rightly in terms of teams and in terms of the ways that we're looking at problems, and particularly in the way that I'm going to talk about engaging with public service users, clients, women, however we want to describe those people. I suppose it was inevitable that the way that my work would go, because I do have an interest in engaging with people, it was inevitable that my work was going to move away from purely researching midwifery issues and look at researching in areas where there would likely to be women and families that are going to use those services. So rather than directly involved in midwifery only related studies, I tend to have broadened out quite a bit. And I suppose the other thing that I was thinking about when I was doing this was, well, how did I get to be so interested in participation? And when I think back to when I was doing my doctorate, I was very influenced by some work by Torbert, who was talking about if you do research on your own, on other people, it's not a very equal relationship. You know, you're not finding out about them other than asking them and then finding out what they say and then interpreting that in your own way. And I felt quite uncomfortable through my doctoral research in that because that was the way my doctoral research study was set up, that, you know, there was a bit missing for me. So I guess as soon as I finished my doctorate, I started looking at research that would bring me more in contact and have a different relationship with the people that I was researching, if you like. So I think that's what brought me to where I am now. There were those sort of early feelings that, you know, just doing research on other people wasn't enough. And I guess it also mirrors the whole thing about being a midwife. In fact, what we do as being, in midwifery, is working with women, not, you know, delivering care for them, but with them. And so those sort of things got me to where I am and to the sort of work that I've been doing. So this morning, what I'd like to do is just talk very briefly about the philosophy behind participatory research. But then go on to talk a bit more practically about some of the things that I've found and some of the impact of things that have come up while I've been doing that research. So it's going to be a bit philosophical at the beginning and then move into being quite practical in terms of the types of involvement that I've been working with, and also some sort of practical tips for thinking about things for yourselves if you're going to look at participatory research. It is a bit difficult though if you're doing a doctoral study, because I supervise students, and the degree of participation in a doctoral study, I think by virtue of the fact it has to be your own unique contribution, make it a bit difficult to go too far down that participatory research approach at the point you're doing your doctorate. But clearly there are some things that you could do and some ways that you can engage with people to make it more participatory, but keeping the right side of the doctoral regulations, obviously. Okay. So You'll all know the consumer movement that started around the Thatcher years, and the fact that in all sorts of areas, business, all sorts of service delivery areas, there was a recognition that the consumer needed to be considered. And the sort of participatory research approach has its sort of basis in that time, really. And it was around the time where there was this active involvement in consumers in all sorts of things that there started to be thoughts about the fact that the people who are the recipients of the research findings, the research that's about them, should actually be more involved in the research process itself, not being passive subjects of the research, but actually being actively engaged in some way in the research. That was still very much a sort of consumer type idea about the participation, in that these are consumers of the product, if you like, so we better ask them what they think. And then things moved on a bit to the fact that actually it was actually more than being a consumer. In fact, as a citizen in the society, you actually had a right to be involved rather than to be sort of treated as a consumer. So it became a much more, if you like, a citizens with rights approach, whereby you actually had a right to be involved. But it also, with those rights, came responsibility as well. And I think is one of the things that when you're working in participatory research methods, you find is always a difficulty, because there are some situations where you find, if you're working with the public, I'm going to call service users because I hate that term, with the public involved in research, where they may feel, well, okay, I'm involved in the research, so my view counts the most. Or on the other hand, if you're the researcher and you think you know what you're doing, you may yourself think, well, I'm the researcher, I'm the expert in this, so it's my view that counts the most. And it's a very fine line, actually, in that negotiation to get it right, in terms of when you're working collaboratively, whose view is the one that becomes uppermost. I mean, it's not always. Sometimes it's quite easy and it's obvious. In other situations, it's not quite so obvious. So you're always treading a very fine line, because it's all very well being a citizen with rights, but if you go into any situation and start demanding your rights, you don't get as far as if you go in negotiating your rights. So with the citizen rights approach, that's now moved on to citizens with rights and also responsibilities, which I think is, a more comfortable position. And I guess also, on the other side of it, it's also a researcher with rights, but also a researcher with responsibilities. So it's an equal power sharing, rather than one person dominating the proceedings. Beresford, who's been very involved in the Involve, which is the government initiative for involving the public in research, talks about managerial consumerism, or democratic approach, which is sort of the two ends of the spectrum I was talking about, in terms of there was sort of ideas about, well, let's manage the whole process of making sure that the public sort of gets some say in things. But that's not quite as empowering a model as having a democratic approach, which is this sort of citizens with rights and responsibility approach that most people are trying to work with now. So there's been a shift. So participatory research has moved from, as I say, the sort of the early ideology of people being involved in research as consumers, to a more democratic and in some cases empowerment model. But I think we have to always be aware that in participatory research there's a spectrum and a degree of involvement in terms of how much involvement the public have in it, what roles that they can play, what role is it appropriate for them to play, which would, I think, determine the degree of the empowerment model that you're likely to see. Sort of research that's very much about social action in communities is going to be much more down the empowerment model of participatory research, whereas perhaps some of the work that we do in the health services is going to be more at the other end of the participatory research approach. So more about participation necessarily than empowerment. Although I think in some areas, and the type of areas that you do see a lot of participatory research are mental health, people with learning disabilities, areas where people do have issues regarding empowerment and the need to sort of develop empowerment models. You do see a lot of participatory research in those areas. So that's probably more likely to be down the sort of empowerment end of it rather than the other end that I'm going to be talking about. So I've had a lot of involvement with Involve, and they let me use their slides because I think they're rather fun. So here's one from them. And you can see what this is all supposed to be about. It's about, there's this thing called research, which is seen to be very important, very clever thing to do. And, there's all of us doing it, the researchers, and we're often, tapping away at our computers and we're interviewing people, and it's all very lovely. But actually, those people who have quite a lot to say about the research that we're going to be doing are missing from that. They're missing from those very early stages of saying what it is we should be researching and how we're going to research it. So Involve is all about trying to encourage people, researchers, to get the public involved at the early stages and in the most appropriate way possible. Okay, so when we're looking at sort of public involvement, because I've moved now from calling it service user involvement, which I didn't like anyway, and it's now public involvement, or lay involvement is the other term that people will use for this type of thing. What does it do? Well, it challenges traditional power structures, because as a researcher, as a professional, I think I know what needs to be researched. But actually, do I? I know what I think needs to be researched. But if I was one of the women and families that I work with, would I really know what's important to them? I think I do, but wouldn't it be better to ask? So that does challenge the traditional power structures, because as a professional, a health professional, you are an expert. You do know what's important, but you don't know what's important in the day-to-day lives of the women and the families that you're working with. And so when you start to do participatory research approaches, you need to be open to that, and to be open to the fact that the thing that you think is really pressing and that's really important to be researching may not be high on the list of the agenda of the people that you're going to be working with. I'm just doing some work facilitating some participatory research for a person with brain injury, acquired brain injury, and he's the member of the public who's actually going to be leading this research, and I'm facilitating him to lead it. And so far, it's taken us 4 months to try to get a question. Now, that's a killer, really. As a researcher, you want to get on with it, a question, do the design and just get on with it. But when you're working in this way, you have to take it really slowly, because you have to be able to understand from the member of public's perspective where they're coming from and why this is important for them and why it's important for this piece of research. And you really have to change your whole mindset. Because, if I was doing a piece of work in acquired brain injury, I'd just read all the literature and say, oh, well, there's the gap. Easy. But actually, that's not meaningful to that man who wants to lead this piece of research. And so it's very much about trying to shift my view of the world to try and see it from his view. Not that I've had his experience, but to try and put myself in his place and be open to waiting for this question to emerge. So it changes traditional power structures. I'm waiting for him because he's the one that's eventually going to say what this research is. And not all research is user-led, but if you are going to do that, then obviously you have to be prepared for that. But you have to be prepared for that to happen to a lesser degree in any type of research when you're taking a participatory approach. So you may not always place control with the users in totality, but, and again, placing the control is almost like a, in itself, you know, the fact that I can place the control with them is almost like something you have to challenge yourself on. So all the way through this process, you're continually challenging yourself as to, you know, am I really pretending to be facilitatory, pretending to be empowering, you know, and then you start beating yourself up, and then you think, oh, don't be daft, you're trying, at least you're trying, and you just have to just keep an eye on yourself, really. So ideology, actuality. There's not a lot of research at the moment evaluating the impact of public involvement. So we can all say this is a wonderful thing, it could be emancipatory, you know, I love doing it, I believe in it, it's because it's my mindset. But is it actually going to make any changes? Because part of participatory research supposedly is that it will ask questions, the right questions that need to be answered for the area that you're researching in our case, for mothers and babies. But what we don't know yet, because there hasn't been enough of the research done, whether it really will change the landscape in the way that, you know, this ideological shift from citizens with rights and responsibilities needs to go. This is, you know, a real important shift in the government's agenda. And it's very interesting to hear you speak about the research frameworks, because certainly every NIH, National Institute for Health Research bid you put in now, you have a section to say what is the public involvement in this research. And if you haven't got it, why not? And if you are doing it, what is it? And they're not interested in token gestures. They really are, you know, serious that the public needs to be involved. So there is increasing amounts of user involvement. I don't think there's not been significant enough amounts yet to be able to evaluate the impact. But the ideology is that it will change the landscape to be much more responsive to what patients, clients, public need from services, and also in every aspect of life today. So if you do Oliver, if you're interested in this, Oliver do a really nice concept analysis of the types of participatory research, the degrees of involvement. It's sort of a meta-analysis of all the research that's out there at the moment, and gives some really interesting perspectives on top-down, bottom-up. And they talk about, you know, the most powerful method of participatory research tends to be if you're working in a collaborative area, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But that tends only to be possible or likely in small-scale research. And if you're doing a big multi-centre trial, then it's actually quite difficult to have a totally collaborative participatory research approach. You probably need to do a bit of consultation, a bit of collaboration, break off pieces, some pieces that can be done through participatory research, and other pieces that have to be done more on consultation basis. So, you know, we're still not absolutely clear what impact this is going to have. And it tends at the moment, most of the research is done around people who are in the vulnerable areas of society, as I said, learning disabilities, people with mental health problems. A lot of community engagement work tends to be done through participatory research, although that is beginning to change, and the Children's in Medicine movement has now involved children in RCT design, well, not designs, but actually in RCT research as people who are involved in the children who are involved in the steering group. So it is moving away from those sort of vulnerable group areas and only sort of qualitative research into RCT and all sorts of research designs. So having sort of mentioned those words, consultation, collaboration and user control, there was a more detailed ladder, it was called, of participation done as a sort of an initial piece of work to describe what public involvement is, or participatory research could be. But Involve have made it very simple in terms of trying to define the degree of involvement of the public in the types of research that is done. And so they've got these three main areas that they would suggest are the ways that you would define what sort of involvement of the public you've got. So there's consultation, which is sort of very clearly things like questionnaires or asking people perhaps in focus groups, although focus groups can also be in the collaborative bit. So things where you can probably ask a lot more people through consultation. Whereas if you're going for collaboration, as I said before, then you're likely to be having sort of smaller scale type projects or small parts of bigger projects. Consultation is good if you want a quick turnaround. You want a lot of information, you want it back quickly. But it's not so good because people are left not knowing what's happened with what they've contributed. And so, you know, you've got the strengths, but you've also got the weaknesses. And it can be token, but any of this can be token, actually, to be honest. So in the middle bit, you've got collaboration, which is where you would involve the public anywhere from actually designing the question or determining the question, right the way through to being on a steering group, to actually being involved in designing the research with you, to collecting the data, to helping you validate the findings, to helping you write up, through to disseminating the research. So there's a whole spectrum of areas that people could be involved in that collaboration section. It doesn't have to be in all of those areas if you're doing collaborative, if you're doing participatory research in the collaborative mode. It can be in some of them. So, you know, it's not always neatly fitting into each one of these boxes. You can have participation at any stage in the research process, and it would still be involvement. So it's sort of a mixed model, really. But this just, I think, helps people think more clearly about the degree of involvement they really have got in their study. And the last one is of course, user control. And that's a very interesting one, because having gone to the Involve conference, I met a lot of people who were not research trained, but wanted to do research, and I think they're very brave people. And you know, I don't mean to be you know, in any way condescending, but it's pretty tough wanting to do research and not having had any training, because basically you're out there with a mission to do research, and then you have to get yourself trained as you go along, which is pretty tough, and it takes an awful long time. But it does happen. Other models are, you can have a user, or rather, sorry, a member of public who wants to do research, and then they can commission somebody like me to facilitate the process for them. So there's lots of different ways of user involvement, user control. It doesn't have to be the user actually being research active themselves. But in some cases it will be, and some people will be starting from scratch, which is, you know, pretty impressive stuff. Difference between participatory and emancipatory research process. I won't go too much into this, but clearly all the sort of things I've been talking about have this whole idea about countering oppression in the research process, and the promotion of participation. Production of useful knowledge to promote change. There is something called participatory action research as well, PAR, But participatory research doesn't always have to be action research. It doesn't have to follow an action research cycle. And it can be, as I say, related to things like trials and product development, which is something I'm doing in this last piece of research I've got on this slide. So it doesn't always have to be emancipatory, and it doesn't always have to be something that's going to make a change in a practice area immediately. And so it can be across the spectrum of research. But I guess, as I said before, if it's going to be emancipatory, then it's going to be fairly likely to be resulting in service change and be related to sort of like that type of research approach. Okay, and it will always result in a different role for the researcher. And there's a very interesting article that, in fact, it's Ruth Northway, who's Professor of Learning Disabilities up in Glamorgan, was involved in that piece of work. And that article is about how the research group, which was made up of people with learning disabilities and Ruth and others, actually went about writing up their research. So the people with learning disabilities actually were involved in the writing up process. And it's a nice description of how they went about that. So if you're interested in seeing how that can be done, that's a good one. So I've talked about that. But if you are going to do a piece of participatory research, it's quite important to be upfront right from the beginning about what the real involvement is. And what I always do is I get a sort of like a map, and I write all the components of the research process down one side, i.e. devising question, so on and so forth, down one side. And then on the top I say level of involvement, sort of consultative, collaborative, and user-controlled, and minimal at the end. You know, it's an additional one I put in. And then I map out my piece of research, and I put little, crosses in the box, so I know whereabouts on that continuum each stage of the research process is. And I've just been doing some work with Gypsy and Travellers, and when we mapped it, it was all in the collaboration in the middle, and I felt really very sad about that. And I thought, well, it would have been nice to have had a little bit of user control in here. So we were talking about that in our group. And what we decided to do was to appoint the chair of the steering group from the Gypsy and Traveller community, because the chair of the steering group in the research is quite a powerful person. And it was quite scary for me because I'm usually the chair. And I had to, trust this person and, say what you like about being open-minded. You're never quite sure of a person until you've actually, seen them do the job. So I was sort of like really quite nervous about all this. And he's done an absolutely excellent job. Done it in a very different way to the way I would have done it. And sometimes I'm sitting there thinking, oops. But then we go back again, and it's absolutely fine. It's just a matter of holding on in there, really. So, as I say, so if you're going to do a piece of participatory research, just map out all the stages of the research process and just see where you are on that continuum for each part of the process, because that will give you a real idea of how participatory your research is. And it doesn't have to be participatory, full user-led or collaboration in every area, but you just have to know. Otherwise, I think sometimes it can look a bit of a token gesture. Okay, I've talked about the next one. Okay, acknowledgement of the potential for cross-cultural challenges. You need to be flexible, you need to negotiate. Again, I suppose this is close to my mind in the piece of work we're doing with Gypsy and Travellers group. We started off with the PCT, working with the PCT and the Friends, Family and Travellers, which is a sort of like voluntary group for Gypsies and Travellers, as their representatives, and the University of Brighton. And we started off to design the research at that stage. And then we got together and we set up the steering group. And then we invited the peer researchers who were Gypsies to the steering group. And then people started to say, well, it's all very well looking at health and the way that people use services, urgent accident and emergency services. But we're talking about gypsies and travellers here who are often moved on, have real problems with having treatments, continued treatment because they're moved on. And what we really need to know is what housing are doing about all this. So we thought, well, okay, I've got my health head on here, but actually that's right, we can't really do this piece of work unless we get housing involved, because we won't know what's happening and how we can help change that, and they won't know what's happening unless we get them involved. So from my sort of like initial health view of all this, it became a bit more socially orientated, housing, and so forth, and other areas got involved as well. So you have to sort of get out of your box a bit and just see what's there and what you need to do to be able to make this participatory research work from the public's view. Your sort of, in this case, gypsy and travellers' view, rather than just your own view. And this is just to remind me to talk a bit about the Early Link project, which was something we did looking at working with mothers and babies. It was a scheme that a woman from 36 weeks pregnant would have a member of the community, they were called early link workers, who weren't professionals, but were women who were wise, if you like, in the ways of helping vulnerable families to bring up children and look after themselves. And so we evaluated this project. So what we did there was we didn't actually have too much public involvement at the beginning. We had some of the parents who were using the scheme, or who had used the scheme in the past. Because the trouble about having people who are actually involved in the research, or rather what you're researching, is sometimes they need to put a bit of space between that experience and reflecting on it and then being in your research at the steering group level. So we had ex-scheme users on the steering group, and we progressed with them inputting. The thing there was that these were women from regeneration areas, which in England means areas of sort of low socio-economic backgrounds, etc. And they weren't terribly confident. And so what we had was a mentoring sort of scheme whereby somebody on the steering group who knew them would enable them to come in, go and pick them up, and sort of help them, facilitate them into the discussions, so that they always had somebody there that was looking out for them and helping them speak when they, I know this sounds a bit crazy, but there's ways, if you've got somebody sitting next to you who's more confident than yourself, if you want to speak, they just give you the confidence. And this is what we did with this sort of mentoring thing. So all the parents had somebody that looked after them and enabled them to contribute. And the other thing is to have more than one or two, because it's very daunting when you've got a group of professionals and researchers in a room to be two people in about 12. So you really need to make sure there's enough of them to feel, whoever the public member of the public are, to feel comfortable in that. So we started off with that, having the parents on the steering group, and then as it progressed and we did the research, we wanted to check out the findings. So we asked, rather than just have the parents on the steering group, because they weren't going through the experience, we asked some of the parents who were involved in the research to actually come in and form a group and to help us just check out that what our interpretation of the findings were had resonance with them. And before we knew it, they got so into it that they used to turn up at the steering group meetings, not invited, but because we wanted to have a participatory approach, that didn't matter. By this stage, we were all in it together. And towards the end, when we wanted to disseminate and do conference presentations, of course those people came and did those presentations alongside of us. I'm very controlling, and I'm sort of sitting with them beforehand saying, we're going to say this, and we're going to say that, and we're going to say this, aren't we? And they're saying, oh yeah. And then we get in there, and they just say what they wanted to say. And it was brilliant, and it was just as good as anything that I could have scripted. So You just have to sort of hold your breath and know it's going to be all right. Yeah. Oops, I think we're stuck on. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so what I've been trying to say by all this is you need to find ways of really making people feel that they're contributing, and what they're contributing is actually going to be of benefit, and it's not just a rubber stamping job. All sorts of things you have to do to make that happen. So this is the public involvement one I did there. Gypsy and Travellers. I'm going to go quite quickly through this because I think I'm probably running out of time. But in this one, as I said, we mapped out where we did have involvement. We had involvement in the design of the study at the beginning by virtue of the voluntary group that supported Gypsies and Travellers being involved in the design, but we didn't actually have Gypsies and Travellers themselves in the design stage. We brought them in at the stage of being peer researchers. So what we did was we set up the steering group and trained the steering group, because that's quite important. You can have public involvement in a steering group or just have people there, but unless the steering group is receptive and understands that this is not a normal work meeting, this is something different that has to be sociable and a bit slower, and people encouraged to speak and being respected for what they say, you don't get very far. So we trained the steering group. We appointed the peer researchers. We've trained the peer researchers as we've gone along in a very informal way, and the peer researchers are Gypsies themselves. And they have gone out and they've done the interviews, because we could not have got access to the sites. We didn't know where the travellers would be. We didn't know how long they were going to be there. They wouldn't have trusted us. They're quite suspicious. They're even suspicious of the peer researchers who are from their own community. So that was really, really powerful. And the peer researchers are involved in analysis interpretation. We're training them to do that. You have to be quite creative about how you do this training. It's real fun, because you can't just do it from a book or do it, like you do if you're teaching in the school or something. You have to use other ways of helping people understand what it is you're trying to get at. And we use lots of postcards and pictures and collages and all sorts of things like that, which is real fun. And as I said, we just felt that we were all done in the middle collaboration, and we would like to have done something with them having more of a proactive role, which is why we decided to appoint a Gypsy as the chair of the steering group. He had already been trained, but if he hadn't been, then we would have provided training for him to do that role. And I was going to, control freak as usual. I said to him, right, fine, that's really good. I said, we'll start off co-chairing it, and then, when you feel confident, I'll sort of back off. And he said, I'm fine. You back off. I think I've has this gone to sleep, you think? Yeah, they sometimes go taking on that for a while, aren't they? Maybe I could take some questions at this point, because I was just rattling through it, and there must be some things you want to say or raise or ask. Okay. Any burning questions? Yeah.
As being on the other side of the table, being involved in the evaluation of projects and watching panels give opinions and the peer reviewers give opinions, I'm trying to move more into a phase of encouraging researchers to involve patients in a meaningful way. Some projects already do, but we need more knowledge in our office to be able to help them and design the applications. How do you write the time is required to say that if you have 4 months trying to get a question? How do you do that? How does the funder propose
Well, I mean that's a big deal, isn't it? Because you don't, you can't tell how long it's going to take. You know it's going to take longer than it normally would. But the point about writing a bid is that everybody's doing it for free, really. Because if you're a researcher, well, you're not doing it for free because you're paid from your institution. But having said that, it's a bit of a risk. If you don't get the bid, then you wasted all the, well, I don't know if I've wasted it, but you've spent a lot of time doing something that you don't necessarily get anything immediate back from in terms of winning a grant. But for the users themselves, they're doing it free at that point because there is no money to pay them, which is a big issue, I think. What we've done to get around that is, it's going to sound very flippant, but it's something. You make sure that they get decent cakes and coffee, and that they're looked after, and whatever you can do to make the environment accessible and the thing enjoyable. But we've started to, in England, through the Research Design Service, which is part of the NIHR infrastructure, to award bursaries for people who want to who want to involve the public in research, so that they can apply for money, so that there can be some payment paid for the public who get involved before the bid. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we've also, in our area, put aside money in our pot for, in the Research Design Service for travelling expenses and things like that. What I've done in my university, because I sort of preempted all this a bit, was that I applied for some internal funding. We have a lot of community engagement work in the University of Brighton, and there's always a bit of money somewhere. So I applied for money for the service user that I'm facilitating to be the lead on this piece of research, so that he gets travelling expenses. And also, because we can't pay him, because the university is absolutely awful at trying to pay anybody, if they're not a lecturer or something like that. Instead of actually giving him cash, can't do that. I sort of bid for some money for him to go on the Involved conference, so £400 or £500 it was. So he got to go on that free, if you like. But still, it's still not quite right, I don't think. So I think most of the sort of ideas about involving the public in terms of research bid is quite problematic, in terms of you don't know how long it's going to take. They have to work with you on it, because they're thinking, am I sitting around here wasting out my time and I'm not getting paid, and they're all sitting there and they've got jobs, sort of thing. But when you actually cost it up to involve the public, for instance, in my Gypsy and Traveller one, I would normally have only had one interviewer, one person doing the interview. But in this case, I costed it out for two, because firstly they were inexperienced, and I thought two together might help each other, and it has. It's really paid off. Also, I costed in, well, normally I'd only cost it in for an hour's interview time, but I doubled up, so I costed it in for 2 hours interview time, and I costed out all their training, and because we are paying the peer researchers, so we paid them to be trained. I doubled up the amount of time the interviews would take, and I doubled up the number of people present at the interview. So I've sort of been much more generous in all the things I've costed, to make sure that there's sufficient money to compensate for all that extra time.
That's really good answer, and it's given us quite a lot of insight. Is there anywhere or a resource where that sort of sounds like handy tips? Is there anywhere that people to know that I not met you today?
Well, Involve, I think, is the best place.
No, I don't need practices, but I'm quite sure there would be ways that we
Yeah.
can.
They've got a website, and most of it's on their website. So if anybody who's interested in doing this type of work, the Involve website is absolutely brilliant, because it's got all those policies about paying people, ways you can go about doing things, handy tips. Yeah, and you can always ring them up as well. Yeah, yeah. I'll just move on quickly. How much longer do you think I should take? We've got to have coffee. 5 minutes. Yeah. I can obviously talk about this later in the day for anybody who wants to. Things stop, so I'm almost going back in. What I wanted to say is, where have we gone? Oh yeah, I didn't want to say anything about that. Oh yeah, this one, parlez-vous research. It's so hard, you know, you think you can talk easy language, it is so hard. And just don't beat yourself up, just make it very clear to people that they can just say to you, I don't understand that, because otherwise, you know, you're just never going to do it completely. You just have to be open to be told, and people feel approachable, that people will say, I don't understand that. Okay, the last bit of work that I'm doing is a virtual learning environment with people with learning disabilities. That might sound a million miles away from midwifery, but it won't be, because people with learning disabilities have babies. And so, therefore, what I try to do whenever I'm doing anything that looks like it's a million miles away, I try to see, well, can I pull out some things that are going to be relevant to mothers and babies in the midwifery service? And all this virtual environment stuff is going to be really relevant in the future, because there's already a virtual hospital, and you can do virtual tours. So you could do a virtual tour of the delivery suite, and you can mock it up so it looks like your real delivery suite. So, you know, there's going to be so much application for this. I'm not bothered that, you know, it's a bit peripheral, really. And it's about decision making and consent giving. And I think, you know, we might be working with women who are more articulate, but there are still real issues about, you know, how you help people understand what's going to happen, and how you really get consent. So it's a bit peripheral, but, you know. But I put this one up here because in this case, we are working with people with learning disabilities who are going to be on the steering group. It's product development, so I won't be getting them to do any peer researchers. But we are working very closely with their people with learning disabilities voluntary groups, so that we can be sure that we're not going to be taking advantage of people with learning disabilities. It's very difficult, because they will say yes, they will say, I want to do this, but part of the thing is getting real consent, like in midwifery. Is it real consent? And we think that working with the advocacy groups and their membership groups is going to mean that they will also be making sure that what we think is consent is really consent. And they will help us disseminate this as well. That's the other thing. If you work with the NCT, you know, you can use their website. So the rest, I think I probably will stop there, is little how to do.
Valerie, you said visibility is very